In this second video, we'll look at the English's first successful colony, their first permanent colony of Jamestown in Virginia. When Elizabeth died in 1603, James I became king. Now, James locked up Raleigh, fearing that he was disloyal, but he shared Raleigh's hopes for an English colony. Just after gaining the throne, James granted company charters to two companies, the London Company and the Plymouth Company. Their claims overlapped, but James required any settlements to be at least 100 miles apart. The Plymouth Company moved first, attempting a colony in what is now Maine. The colony, however, quickly failed. It was so cold. As James I granted these charters, the Dutch sent the explorer Henry Hudson to discover a Northwest Passage. His efforts in 1607 discovered the Hudson River and thus gave the Dutch a claim on that area. We'll talk about the Dutch claims later on. Later in 1609, Hudson sort of switched sides, I guess you say, and sailed under an English flag, an English king, and discovered the Hudson Bay, giving James I a claim to that area for the north. Hudson eventually, by the way, faced a mutiny and was abandoned up there on the Hudson Bay, and he was never to be seen. Nobody knows what happened to him. Anyway, as the Plymouth Company failed in Maine, and as Henry Hudson was exploring for the Dutch, the London Company, which soon became known as the Virginia Company, by the way, sent 3 ships and 104 colonists to establish a colony in the Chesapeake Bay. They sailed up a river they named the James River, after obviously James I, and established a fort at what they called Jamestown. And of Jamestown, as I said, it's going to become the first permanent English settlement in America. The first year was brutal. Many of the settlers didn't plant crops, and they just tried in vain to find gold. The Indians were not welcoming, and by the next year, 1608, only 38 of the original 104 settlers had survived. The Virginia Company had Jamestown's leaders elected, but when the former soldier John Smith arrived, Smith shown on the left here, he established a form of martial law, and he mandated work. You don't work, you don't eat. And his efforts arguably saved the colony. Many historians believe that as Smith negotiated with the nearby Indian chief Powhatan, Powhatan threatened to cut off his head. The chief's young teenage daughter, named Pocahontas, intervened to save Smith's life. If this incident actually took place, Powhatan, many historians believe, may have staged it as a way to impress Smith of his power. When Smith had to return to England in 1609, discipline broke down at Jamestown, and the colonists didn't have enough food to survive the winter of 1609 to 1610. This became known as the starving time. Under Smith, the colony had grown to almost 500 settlers, but after the starving time, by early 1610, only 60 people remained alive. There's some evidence that the colonists resorted to cannibalism, eating their dead colleagues over that winter. What ended up saving the colony was tobacco, a Native American plant. As noted earlier, the Indians smoked it, but the Europeans didn't like it. John Rolfe, however, shown on the left, learned a way to cure the tobacco, to hang it and dry it, and it made it smoother and more palatable to European taste. Tobacco soon caught on with the Europeans, who couldn't grow it in Europe. And there'd been no gold in Virginia, but now Jamestown and the Virginia Company, they had a staple or a cash crop that they could sell to England. And, they had a way to raise money and to reinvest in the colony, and therefore the colony began to grow. Rolfe ended up marrying Pocahontas. Many people thought it was John Smith, but it was Rolfe, and he married Pocahontas, and he brought her back to England. The picture to the right is a contemporaneous drawing of Pocahontas in England. She became quite a novelty and attraction, but the exposure to Europe and its diseases and climate didn't obviously suit her, and she ended up dying in Europe, never saw Virginia again. The Jamestown or Virginia colony began to grow faster, and in 1618 to 1619, several important events took place. First, in 1618, the Virginia Company instituted the Headright System to attract more settlers. The cost of transportation across the Atlantic was often prohibitive for many would-be laborers, the poor people, and the Headright policy was a solution. It granted 50 additional acres of land for every additional person a settler or investor paid for. So if a rich guy paid for a worker to come over, the rich guy would get additional land. And that was a way to get people to, a way to raise money to get people to cross the Atlantic, to pay for their trip. Second, in 1619, the Virginia Company began to allow the settlers a form of self-government, which of course made it more attractive. They had a legislature known as the House of Burgesses, which is still what they call Virginia legislature today. It was one of the first roots of democracy in America. Third, in 1619, the company brought a larger number of women to Virginia. A small number of women has come in part of families as early as 1608, but they had remained few otherwise. The new women were often destitute and kidnapped from the wharfs of England and were then sold as wives to the Virginia colonists. Now, the importance of this was, of course, because women helped make the colony more stable and attractive to potential settlers. Finally, fourthly, in 1619, the first Africans arrived in Virginia. The, quote, 20 and odd, unquote, Africans that were recorded arrived were sold to a settler, but were not technically slaves. As a formal institution in law, slavery had not yet been developed in Virginia. The first Africans, rather, were part of a bounty that the English privateer had stolen from a Portuguese slave ship it had raided. Portugal had already codified slavery legally. Now, after the raid, the English ship had then gone directly to Virginia with all the valuables of the Portuguese ship, the Africans included. It's unclear, but believed that these first Africans were not considered property for life after they were sold. The first Africans may have been considered like a growing number of poor English immigrants who arrived as part of the indentured servant system. A sea captain or investor would buy the promise of labor from a poor person in exchange for paying that person's expenses to get to America. Again, crossing the Atlantic was expensive. When the ship arrived in Virginia, the sea captain would then sell the contract promising labor to an existing settler. The indentured servant would then work for that settler for the agreed upon period of years, usually 7 years. At the end of that term, the settler would have to free the indentured servant, who could then establish himself as independent in the new colony. This technical codification of slavery for Africans, the technical codification of slavery for Africans would develop later. I should note here that there was a conscious attempt to get people to come to the new world. There were a lot of pamphleteers claiming that things were great there. One of them was Richard Hakluyt, shown here on the left. He promoted the benefits of settling the New World with his writings and publications and was sort of a bestseller and got more people to come. While Virginia had begun to grow by the early 1620s and its survival was now less in doubt, the colony still had problems. The price of tobacco suddenly dropped and the Virginia Company faced bankruptcy. To make matters worse, Indians made several attacks on the colony, most notably in 1622. In that attack, 25% of the colony was killed, including John Rolfe. James I was already worried about the potential independence of the House of Burgesses, and with the colony's other financial problems, he decided to revoke the Virginia Company's charter. In 1624, the colony got a new royal charter. As an official royal colony, therefore, Virginia had the benefits of the Crown's finances and more efficient governance, even if the change meant less control for the colony itself. The colony of Virginia was now set for even greater growth. This concludes the second video on the first permanent English colony of Jamestown in Virginia.